So we are going to take a deep dive this week into fiscal policy. What was that again? Fiscal policy. Whose policy is fiscal policy? The government. What kind? What kind of government? Federal government? Yes. It can include state government. What kinds of stuff? What's our main things we're thinking about here? Taxes, yes, and government spending. So, back to our basic market system here of thinking about the agents at hand. We've got households. These are the people we really care about, hopefully. We've got businesses, which is a small fraction of the households that during 8 hours a day or so, they join forces with other human beings that are trying to pursue their happiness in the form of a company or a firm, a way to use their specialized skills, their unique attributes to earn an income. Right? And so they get paid their paycheck, and then they run to Walmart, they run to Applebee's, they do their thing up here in the goods market. So households and firms are a couple agents that we've talked about in a variety of different ways. And then we've got the man in the middle, the government man, right? Man in terms of human, as we learned, there's plenty of females in the White House as well, and in the Federal Reserve for that matter too. And so how does the government raise funds? Through taxation. Where does it come from? There's only two places. It either comes from the output market, the market for final goods and services, through a sales tax, right? Sammy, what you pecking at? Busted type thing, or all right. So we've got sales tax up in the output market. And that will have some implications on the flow of goods and services, right? So we're going to learn a little bit more about that here in this chapter on the implication of a sales tax. Does currently the federal government have a sales tax at the cash register? Is part of your 7 or 8.9% in Kansas, usually, depending on your county, is that going to the feds at all? No, that's going to state and local governments. So that has been kind of what's evolved over time, is that we let the state and local governments collect their money up here, and then the feds collect most of their money down here. Now, the feds also collect some indirect taxes that can be linked to some of the final goods and services. So there's like maybe some special taxes on cigarettes and booze and some other things like that. So there's some indirect taxation that can go on. But for the most part, that cash register tax that we pay is funding state and local governments.
Cars don't make standards.
No. Oh, if they don't make standards, yeah, that could possibly be if there's a fine or a fee. So I think he was bringing up if cars don't meet fuel efficiency standards or something and there's a fine, that could be a form of an indirect money that influences ultimately the price of that Hummer or something. But the automobile companies can, as long as they have some super high efficiency and some gas hogs, that they actually look at the balance of the cars that they're providing to meet some of those standards. All right, so downstairs in this market is primarily our income tax, which do the states collect some income tax down here as well? Does Kansas have a state income tax? How many of you are Kansans? How many of you paid some tax How many of you got your little W-2 form and it said state tax withholdings? That's a good clue that they do charge a state income tax. Yes, so those of you who are in Kansas, you have a state income tax. Not every state does. So Tennessee, Florida, South Dakota, there's a handful of states that don't have a state income tax. Currently, Kansas is considering that. That's at least kind of loosely on the table. I don't know if anybody really believes for sure it will come out, but there is some talk about Kansas eliminating the state income tax. Why do you think they do something like that? Why would that even be on the table to possibly eliminate the state income tax?
Can't they make it up through sales tax and property tax?
Good. Okay, so that's one thing.
They don't have to manage it.
Yeah, that's one reason, is that they might be able to make it up in other areas. And so it's kind of like, well, we have a tax up here at the cash register and a tax down here. Wouldn't it be just a little bit simpler if we just collected it in one place rather than the other? Okay, that's one idea. What else might elimination of an income tax do for the state of Kansas long term? Kind of be thinking long term. Boost GDP, how? Okay, so there could be part of that. Put more money into people's pockets, the existing Kansans. Invite more people to come to Kansas, right? So we got maybe the existing Kansans that might have some sort of stimulus effect, if you will, by lower income taxes. But also, maybe more importantly, is who we would attract to the state of Kansas. Because as people are thinking, should I live in Missouri, or should I live in Nebraska, or should I live in, I could live in either place. My job is flexible now because I can work from home part of the day, so it's not too big a deal. What state should I pick? Especially on a border state like Kansas and Missouri, where you've got a major metropolitan area where you can literally commute to work one way or the other. That could be an important factor. So attracting new people and new businesses, because when you've eliminated the state income tax, you've also done that at the corporate level too. So you might be stimulating businesses, attracting new businesses to your state, possibly doing that as well.
On income tax like that, if you work in Kansas and live in Missouri,
If you what? Live in one place and get in the other? There are some equalizations between the two. So yes, if you earn income in one state, you might face their tax rate, and then there's kind of a breakdown of how you do it. You won't get double dipped. There's kind of an equalization thing that they do. So, okay, so that is on the resource market. So again, just want to make sure you got off the top of your head here that in terms of our marketplace, the government's either entering the market for final goods and services, or they're entering the resource market to collect taxes. And so there's a little straw here that's siphoning money up that's not making it over here, is the other key point. Now, the balance to that is, well, we need the government to have laws and courts and roads and police, and so we need to have a straw here. I certainly would not be one to say we don't need a straw. So how big is that straw? Do we got one of those monster wide ones from the smoothie, that's got the 1 inch? Do we have that kind of straw? Or do we have one of those little coffee ones, that has just the little tiny holes in it? What's the size of that straw that we're sucking from down here on the flow? That's a big question. Part of what we're going to tackle in this material with fiscal policy. Okay. Any other last questions or comments there? Tee you up. All right. So I think we'll try to tackle the big nut here first, and that is a discussion of debt versus deficit. Debt versus deficit. So debt versus deficit. What's the diff? I don't think I've ever really thought about that way. We got deficit, debt. What's the diff? So, deficit versus debt. They're related, but they're totally different from each other. Who wants to tackle that one? Debt versus deficit. Maybe debt's the easier one to think of, but go ahead, Christian, either way.
I think debt is what we owe to other people.
Okay.
What we owe to other people. Deficit, that have to do with economic expenditure, basically spending more.
Okay, so something to do with that spending thing that we talked about. Yeah, so let's stick with debt first. So when you think about debt, is it a stock variable or a flow variable? I've been attacking you all semester long with a thing I think we started with maybe on day one. Stock variable, is it a bucket item or is it a flow item? The debt. Flow? So we got a certain amount of flow. Let's see, how did that work again on whether something was a stock variable or flow variable? If I told you I make 120,000 bucks, am I rich or poor? What's that? It depends on the time frame. Making it a income is a flow or a stock variable. So if I make $120,000 a month, I'm pretty rich. If I make $120,000 over the last 10 years, I'm in poverty, below the poverty line. So it only has meaning, income of $120,000 per year, for instance. It only has meaning over a period of time. In other words, it's how much you made from this date for the next 365 days, right? It's over a period of time. So is income a flow or a stock? And how do we tell the difference? How many people say flow? I heard a flow. Show of hands. How many people say stock? Show of hands. Okay, it's close. The stocks are in the minority. And the income is a flow over a period of time. So when we think about the picture, I have a certain amount of income or investment. In this particular picture, we were talking about the purchases of computers, machines, buildings, right? That variable from cigarettes, C plus I plus G plus X, that's the I, that's the investment. It's the amount of purchases that were done this year. And what does it impact? It impacts the stock of capital. At a point in time, if we freeze time right now, we can add up the stock of machinery, computers, and stuff that makes other stuff at a point in time. So the level of capital is our bucket item, a stock variable. The amount of purchases of computers over the course of the year is a flow. So what is the national debt? The debt, the money that we owe is what Christian said, that's correct. The money that we owe, is it the money that we owe, is that a stock variable or a flow variable? Does it have meaning at a point in time, or do I have to specify a time period with it? The debt. How many of you are in debt right now? Should be most of you, I'm guessing. Yeah, a good vast majority. So, do you know how much you owe today, or could you reasonably calculate it if you went back to your computer and checked your spreadsheets and stuff, right? So, is your debt level a stock variable or a flow variable? It's a stock, right? It has meaning at a point in time. Like right now, if I told you that I owe $150,000 worth of debt, that has meaning. You know what $150,000 means. That's a lot of money. Or if you guys are looking at your student loan balance, that has meaning today. If you owe $16,573, that has meaning. Right now, you owe it. You have to pay it back at some point. All right, so the debt is the stock variable. It has meaning at a point in time. So therefore, what's the deficit? It's the flow. And what's the relationship between the two? Give me a sentence that would capture the connection between the two. Let me try to go to somebody else. I'll come back to you. In fact, Todd, why don't you give me a number between 5 and 13? 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Joe, give me a sentence that describes debt and deficit. So debt is the amount we owe at a point in time, which is what we were just saying. How does that relate then to this flow variable deficit? How could you put that into a sentence for me that connects the two?
You have a deficit and you have debt.
Okay. What happens if you? I'll roll with you there. If let's say you have a deficit and a debt at the same time. I need a sentence that kind of combines those two. So let's say you have both of those things going on. You need a little bit more meat on the bones, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Connor, take a stab at this. So let's say you have both of them at the same time. I have a debt and I ran a deficit. Okay, good. You're getting a little bit closer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the more, so Connor said, just to be clear, the more of a deficit you have, the more debt you'll have. Okay, so we're getting a little closer. I want to narrow that down, that definition. So hopefully we got it down. Bo?
The debt is the certain point in time that you check your deficit.
No, we got derailed there a little bit. He said the debt is the certain point of time that you check your deficit. Did I characterize that all right? Not quite right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Back to tag. Must have an even number here to get right back to. Okay, each year's deficit flows into your total debt. Okay, so that's starting to get real close. We could narrow it down a little bit further, but I think you've got the idea. So this year's, you put the time frame on it because this is a flow variable. I can't remember if you said this year's or this time. You said this year's. So this year's deficit, if Obama runs a $1 trillion deficit, that's going to add to the existing $15 trillion worth of debt. So a $1 trillion deficit this year will make the debt climb to $16 trillion. See the connection there? So this was over a period of time, and it's going to make this thing change. It's going to make it either get bigger or smaller. And for the United States government, we tend to like this upward trend, apparently, because we're just kind of making it bigger each time. We keep one of those, but we'll talk more about that as we go. All right, so what's the diff? Let's write some of these stuff down here. So debt is a stock variable that has meaning at a point in time. It is the accumulation of previous deficits, which is a slightly different way of wording what we said. It is the accumulation of previous deficits. The deficit is a flow variable that only has meaning over some time period. For example, 1 year, which will be pretty common for us to look at. for governments, we can look at it a couple different ways. And I don't want to, I'm going to put it both here so that we don't screw it up. The deficit is equal to G minus T. Now, hopefully, because this is where we're really going to get into some details this chapter, I don't want you to be confused with the way this is written, because what we've done before when we talked about the savings chapter, for instance, is we said government savings in a given year is equal to T minus G. If G is bigger than T, savings is what? Savings is what kind of number? A negative number, right? So it's going to be, if this is 100 and this is 90, then we get a negative 10 worth of savings. And what do we call that? A deficit. So negative savings is the deficit. Notice all I did here is I flipped the two signs around. When we talk about the deficit, we don't say it's a negative deficit, because if it was a negative deficit, it would actually be a positive number. Okay? Not trying to be funny with numbers, but this is the way we talk about it. If this year's deficit is $1 trillion, I'm expressing that as a positive number, right? When I verbalize it. If this year's deficit is $1 trillion, it means that G was bigger than T by about $1 trillion, right? But I don't say a negative $1 trillion unless I was saying government saving is a negative. So let's put that little note here. As you read through the chapter, you might see that pop up once in a while. So note, negative savings is equal to the deficit. Notice I put the negative number here. All right, so the bottom line is that if G, government spending, is greater than tax collections, then government has a deficit. They literally do not have enough dollars to pay all their bills. What happens to you guys when you don't have enough dollars to pay all your bills this month? What do? You borrow. You take on debt by the amount you're short. So if the government is short $1 trillion, they're going to need to take on debt. And how does the government do that, the federal government? What sort of financial instrument do they use? What is it? The bonds, right, the government bonds. So remember, we had multiple conversations with our little bond instrument here. That'll come back into play a little bit this chapter. That the government goes to the world through Wall Street and issues these little things, right? Love the government. I need $1 million, and so I'm going to get that million by giving this piece of paper, and I've been pretty good about paying my bills back. That loan comes to us via the financial securities market of a U.S. government bond, and that's usually if the duration is longer than a year. Otherwise, it's called a T-bill or a treasury note. So if we have a T-bill is something with less than 1 year duration. So sometimes the government does, I'm in a pinch here, just give me 3 months worth of a loan. And so literally this piece of paper will just be for 3 months. They'll go and we got some loaded wealthy person like Sarah here out in the market, and Obama says, hey, I'll just need this for about 3 months. Is that okay? Is that cool? And she says, yeah, she buys it. If she's sick of holding it, what can she do? What can she do if she's tired of holding it after a month? She sells it and passes it off to Samantha, right? There goes that bond market. So that's the active bond market that can be done. It's a tradable security that you can easily sell it on Wall Street and make some maneuvers as you need to. Okay, so questions or comments on that? All right, so how big is too big? So I'm going to do a little PowerPoint stuff today. I think it was the first year I started here at OU, I did a presentation. And let's get this down. And I called it Debts and Deficits, Does Size Matter? That was the clever little title I had here. Let's see, PowerPoint. There it is, right here. Okay, so we've actually seen part of this thing here. I'm going to jump down to this part. The remote clicker. I'm not sure if this thing works or not. Okay, so back when I gave this is kind of interesting to look at. The federal debt was 14 and some change. So that's $14 trillion in kind of all of its glory here. And some interesting things that the general public doesn't usually think about is that a lot of the government debt is owned by other parts of government. So it's like this agency owes this agency, and it's called intragovernmental debt. And of the 14 trillion, so right now you'll hear 16, 17 trillion dollar number. That is like the total federal debt. But do you think we should count the debt that one arm of government owes the other arm of government? Kind of like a little family loan. Like, what's our family debt? Well, John owes his brother Ken, but if we think about the family debt, then why would we count that? Because once Ken pays his brother back, then it all stayed within the family anyway, right? So that's what this intragovernmental debt is, to the tune of, at this time in 2011, was $4.5 trillion. And so that leaves us with $9.7 trillion held by the public. Of that fraction, some of it we owe Americans. So again, depending on how we're looking at it, is like, well, if the government owes an American part of the debt, you know, it kind of stays in the family again, if we think about it that way. Although now, bear in mind from our agent list here, instead of borrowing from one arm of government to the other arm, now all of a sudden we're borrowing from agents, but within the United States. So depending on how you think about that, we can look at the amount of debt that's held by foreigners. That's the one that maybe seems a little more alarming if we have China owing a large fraction of our debt. And for the first time in history, it has surpassed 50%. And at this point, it wasn't there of the public debt. The public debt held by foreigners was $4.5 trillion. It was $9.7 trillion total. We were under 50%. Since then, that's gone over. And so we owe the rest of the world more money than we owe Americans. Okay, so however we slice it, we want to start to kind of think about it. So I took the number here, and I kind of wanted to just show it in all its glory because it's very rare that we see all the zeros in kind of the big letters. So here is the picture of the pie of the share of U.S. Treasuries by foreigners. Here's China. At that time was 1.1 trillion of the 4.5 trillion, and then we got Japan. So China and Japan are the major players of our debt, and then we've got the rest of the world with all these little slices. There's Russia. You know, they're probably not doing so good right now. I bet their slice is a little bit different, but at least gives you a snapshot. United Kingdom, Brazil, that all of the major governments have held some of the U.S. Treasury securities. All right, any questions or comments there? Just kind of want to give you a little bit of a feel for this stuff. Yeah.
The United States is net borrower.
What's that?
Does that make the United States a net borrower?
Net borrower, yes. So we are on net borrowing from the rest of the world. Yes. Okay, anything else? All right, so moving right along here, we've got some people. Each year this changes, and depending on the circumstances within each country, you can imagine that they might have a little bit more of a taste for our debt. And so here I just kind of went through and looked at how the changes were from one time period to the next. So we got a stock variable and a flow variable, right? I measured the stock from July 2010. Here's July 2011, and here's how their percentages changes. In aggregate, if I take all the countries of the world, there was only a net change of 8.5%. So by the pluses and the minuses of some people saying, I don't want any more U.S. debt, I want some. So the flow of that changes the holdings of the foreigners over time. And it was especially, I said the wow up here in this particular case, the United Kingdom dumped a lot of, or increased holdings, 228%. All right, so here's what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and write this number in your notes. 97558, and then it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 zeros. You can put little commas, but part of the exercise is kind of thinking about those commas, but that's why none of the commas are shown here. It's a big number. Next, I want you to put what the United States income is. In 2011, it was here, which is how much money? What's the United States income? How much money are we making according to this number? $14.5 trillion, right? So we're in the trillions. Again, don't forget that according to the economics we've been covering here, the aggregate sum of all of the people's incomes equals $14.5 trillion. So in some ways, that's one way of thinking how much money we're making. Okay, so line them up like this thing says. So write it underneath it if you haven't done so. This is kind of an interesting exercise. So make sure everything's just kind of stacked on top of each other. This year's deficit in 2011, which it's continued to be, was $1.3 trillion. So the amount that we were going in the hole this year was $1.3 trillion in 2011. By the way, we've continued to maintain about $1 trillion deficit each year since 2011, which is a little unsettling. So line them up again. We got debt, income, deficit. So any questions so far? So the title of my talk here was, Does Size Matter? And, in fact, let me